There comes a moment in every toxic relationship when the narcissist realizes something has changed inside you. Not your appearance, not your words, your energy. Your silence no longer carries fear. Your boundaries no longer shake when challenged. Your eyes no longer beg for understanding. And that is the moment they become dangerous in a different way. Because a narcissist can tolerate your pain. They can tolerate your tears. They can tolerate your anxiety, your overthinking, your emotional exhaustion. What they cannot tolerate is your clarity. The moment you begin seeing through the illusion, they understand they are losing access to the emotional control they once had over you. And when control starts slipping away, they rarely leave peacefully. They create confusion, not because they are confused, because confusion weakens you. Suddenly, the person who ignored your suffering becomes soft and emotional. The same person who dismissed your feelings now speaks gently. The one who once blamed you for everything suddenly says, "I miss who we used to be." And a wounded heart wants to believe that means love has returned. But often, it is not love returning. It is strategy returning, because emotional confusion is the final doorway back into your mind. A narcissist understands something most people never realize. A confused person is easier to control than a broken one. Broken people eventually collapse and walk away. But confused people stay. They question themselves. They replay conversations at night. They search for hidden meanings in mixed signals. They hold on to hope while drowning in uncertainty. And hope, in the hands of a manipulative person, becomes a weapon. So they begin sending contradictory messages. One day they love you deeply. The next day they disappear emotionally. One moment they apologize with tears in their eyes. The next moment they accuse you of being cold and unforgiving. They pull you close just enough to reopen the emotional bond, then push you away just enough to reactivate your fear of abandonment. And your nervous system becomes trapped between relief and panic. That is not connection, that is emotional conditioning. Your body begins craving the moments of affection because they are rare. You start interpreting crumbs as healing. You begin celebrating basic decency because the emotional deprivation was so severe. And this is how people lose themselves without noticing. Not through one dramatic betrayal, but through thousands of moments that slowly disconnect them from their own inner truth. The narcissist's final trick is not rage, it is false vulnerability. They suddenly speak about childhood wounds. They tell you nobody understands them. They admit just enough pain to awaken your empathy again. And if you are a compassionate person, you immediately feel guilty for protecting yourself. You begin thinking, maybe they're finally changing. Maybe they were just hurting. Maybe I gave up too soon. But trauma can explain harmful behavior without excusing repeated emotional destruction. A wounded person may hurt you unintentionally, but a narcissistic pattern continues hurting you after seeing the damage clearly. That is the difference people struggle to accept. Because your heart wants to separate the cruelty from the human being. You want to believe the loving version was the real one and the hurtful version was temporary. But often, the loving version only appeared when they feared losing control. Real love does not suddenly appear when access is threatened. And one of the most painful truths is realizing they did not return because they finally saw your value. They returned because they noticed you were finally seeing your own value. Your healing became the threat. When you stop chasing them, they chase you. When you stop explaining, they demand conversations. When you emotionally detach, they suddenly become emotional. Not always because they love you deeply, but because your freedom exposes the illusion they built around themselves. A narcissist often needs to feel psychologically central in your life. Your reactions feed their sense of importance. Your emotional dependency reassures them that they still matter. So when you become calm, grounded, and emotionally independent, they experience something they cannot control: irrelevance. And irrelevance terrifies people who built their identity around control. So they create emotional smoke, confusion, mixed messages, false breakthroughs, half apologies, emotional bait, moments of tenderness followed by emotional distance. Not enough consistency to build trust. Just enough emotion to keep you emotionally invested. And many people mistake intensity for intimacy. But intensity is not proof of love. Chaos is not passion. Emotional obsession is not connection. Sometimes the strongest addiction is not to the person. It is to the hope that one day the pain will finally make sense. So you stay longer than your soul can survive. You explain your boundaries repeatedly to someone committed to misunderstanding them. You sacrifice your peace, trying to prove your goodness to someone who benefits from your self-doubt. And slowly, your identity disappears. You begin monitoring your tone, your facial expressions, your timing, your reactions. You become hyper-aware of their moods while abandoning your own emotional reality. This is why emotional confusion is so destructive. It disconnects you from yourself. You stop asking, "How do I feel?" and start asking, "How do I keep them calm?" You stop trusting your instincts because every instinct was questioned, minimized, or turned against you. Eventually, you become emotionally exhausted from carrying both your pain and their emotional instability. And yet the hardest part is this. Even after all the damage, part of you still wants them to become the person you hoped they were. Because human beings are wired for attachment, especially when love and pain become emotionally intertwined. Your nervous system confuses unpredictability with emotional depth. The inconsistency creates obsession. The uncertainty creates longing. The rare moments of warmth feel euphoric because they interrupt prolonged emotional starvation. And this is why leaving emotionally confusing relationships can feel like withdrawal, not because the relationship was healthy, but because your body became conditioned to survive emotional instability. Healing begins the moment you stop asking whether they finally understand your pain and start asking why you learn to tolerate being emotionally confused in the first place, because clarity feels unfamiliar to wounded people. Peace can initially feel boring when your nervous system was trained in chaos. Consistency can feel suspicious when unpredictability became normal. But real love does not force you to abandon yourself to keep the connection alive. Real love does not make you question your worth every week. Real love does not repeatedly reopen wounds and call it intimacy. And the moment you truly understand this, the narcissist's final trick begins losing its power. The moment you begin healing, the entire relationship changes. Not because they changed, because you did. A narcissistic dynamic survives on one thing above all else: your emotional dependency, your need to be understood, your need to be chosen, your need to finally receive the love you kept proving you deserved. As long as you remain emotionally trapped in that cycle, the manipulation continues effortlessly, because every reaction becomes access. Every explanation becomes another opportunity for them to twist reality. Every emotional wound becomes a doorway back into your mind. But healing interrupts the pattern they relied on. The moment you stop defending your worth, something inside the narcissist begins to panic, because people who manipulate others survive through emotional leverage, and emotional leverage disappears the moment you stop needing their permission to feel valuable. That is why your healing feels threatening to them. Not your anger, not your tears, your calmness. Your silence becomes unbearable because it no longer contains desperation. Your boundaries become powerful because they are no longer emotional negotiations. You stop trying to convince them to care. You stop trying to explain pain to someone committed to misunderstanding it. And for the first time, your energy belongs to you instead of the emotional battlefield. This is the part many people misunderstand about healing. Healing is not becoming emotionally numb. It is becoming emotionally clear. You begin noticing patterns instead of isolated moments. You stop clinging to occasional kindness while ignoring consistent harm. You stop romanticizing potential and start seeing reality. And once reality becomes visible, manipulation loses much of its power. Because narcissistic dynamics depend on emotional fog. Confusion keeps you attached. Self-doubt keeps you compliant. Hope keeps you waiting. But healing clears the fog. You begin realizing how often you abandoned yourself just to preserve the connection. How many times you silenced your intuition because you feared losing them. How many nights you spent overanalyzing conversations while they slept peacefully after hurting you. And suddenly, your suffering stops feeling romantic. It starts feeling revealing. You recognize that love was never supposed to require the destruction of your nervous system. You understand that constantly walking on eggshells is not emotional intimacy. You realize that if someone only treats you well when they fear losing you, that is not safety. That is control responding to consequences. And once you see this clearly, you stop participating the same way. That is what breaks the cycle. Not revenge, not proving them wrong, not becoming cold. You simply stop feeding the emotional machine. You no longer react to every accusation. You no longer chase after emotional closure they were never willing to give. You stop begging someone to recognize pain they benefited from ignoring. And for a narcissist, this emotional detachment feels like losing oxygen, because narcissistic relationships are often built around emotional reactions. Your sadness feeds their importance, your anxiety feeds their control, your constant emotional focus reassures them they still occupy the center of your world. But healing shifts the center back to you. You wake up one day and realize your life cannot continue revolving around someone else's emotional instability. You realize you have spent years trying to earn basic respect from someone who should have given it freely. You see how your empathy was weaponized against you, how your compassion kept becoming permission for repeated emotional harm. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is understanding how much of yourself you lost while trying to keep the relationship alive. You lost peace. You lost emotional safety. You lost trust in your own perceptions. You lost the ability to relax fully because your nervous system adapted to unpredictability. But healing begins returning those pieces slowly. You start trusting your instincts again. You stop apologizing for boundaries. You no longer feel guilty for protecting your emotional health. You begin noticing how exhausting it was to constantly manage another person's fragile ego while neglecting your own emotional wounds. And this shift changes everything, because the narcissist no longer recognizes the version of you they once controlled. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending yourself against false narratives. You stop trying to rescue the relationship single-handedly, and your refusal to engage emotionally frustrates them more than any argument ever could. Why? Because your healing exposes the truth. It reveals that the relationship was never sustained by mutual love. It was sustained by your willingness to self-abandon. That is why many narcissists become more manipulative when they sense your growth. Not because your healing is wrong, because your healing threatens the emotional structure they depended on. The stronger you become internally, the weaker their influence becomes externally. And suddenly they start doing things that confuse you. They become affectionate again, attentive again, emotionally expressive again, not necessarily because they transformed, but because they sense they are losing emotional access to you. And if you are not careful, healing can accidentally awaken guilt inside you. You may start wondering, what if they're finally changing? What if I'm abandoning them? What if I'm being too harsh? But your healing is not cruelty. Your boundaries are not punishment. Your emotional distance is not abuse. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop sacrificing yourself for someone who only values you when you are emotionally available for control. And this is where true healing becomes difficult. Because healing forces you to grieve not only the person, but the fantasy that one day they would suddenly become emotionally safe, the fantasy that your loyalty would eventually heal them, the fantasy that if you loved deeply enough, suffered quietly enough, explained clearly enough, things would finally change. But healing means accepting that your suffering was never the missing ingredient. You were already loving enough, already patient enough, already understanding enough. The cycle continued because the relationship depended on imbalance. And the moment you restored balance within yourself, the entire system began collapsing. That is why healed people often appear different to narcissists. Not louder, not crueler, just unavailable for emotional manipulation. They stop reacting impulsively. They stop arguing with distortions. They stop needing validation from someone incapable of giving genuine emotional safety. And that emotional independence is powerful, because once you no longer need the narcissist to confirm your worth, their ability to control your emotional world weakens dramatically. You begin discovering something life-changing. Peace is more valuable than emotional intensity. Clarity is more valuable than temporary affection. Self-respect is more valuable than being chosen by someone incapable of healthy love. And slowly, your nervous system begins learning a new reality. Love should not feel like survival. Connection should not require self-erasure. You should not have to betray yourself to keep someone close. Your healing breaks the cycle because you finally stop confusing emotional suffering with love. The most misunderstood part of emotional entanglement is the belief that the struggle is still happening between you and the other person. It feels external because that is where the pain originated, where the confusion was planted, where the betrayal was experienced. But as time passes, something subtle becomes clear. The real battleground is no longer outside of you. It has moved inward. And this is the part most people are not prepared for. Because even when the narcissist is no longer present, their influence can still echo inside your thoughts. not as a person standing in front of you, but as a voice that questions your memory, your judgment, your worth, your interpretation of what happened. You may find yourself replaying conversations, trying to find the exact moment where things shifted, as if understanding that moment will finally give you peace. But the deeper truth is that clarity alone does not end the internal conflict. Something more fundamental has to change within your emotional system. The final battle is not about confronting them. It is about dismantling the internalized version of the dynamic they left behind. Because long after someone leaves your life, the emotional imprint they created can continue operating inside your nervous system. The doubt they planted becomes self-doubt. The guilt they triggered becomes self-judgment. The confusion they created becomes your default way of interpreting relationships. And without realizing it, you may begin continuing the conversation with them inside your own mind. This is why distance alone does not always bring peace. You can remove someone physically and still remain entangled emotionally. You can block their number and still hear their voice in your thoughts. You can end the relationship and still find yourself defending your decisions in imaginary arguments that never end. The body leaves the situation, but the emotional pattern remains active. And this is where the real struggle begins. The internal battle is often silent, and because it is silent, it is easy to underestimate. It shows up in hesitation when you try to trust yourself again. It shows up in overthinking simple decisions. It shows up in the way you second-guess your feelings even when nothing external is happening. It shows up in the strange discomfort of peace, as if calmness itself feels unfamiliar or unsafe. And beneath all of this is a deeper conflict. The part of you that knows the truth versus the part of you that was trained to doubt it. One part remembers the emotional reality clearly. The other part has been conditioned to question that memory. One part wants to move forward. The other part keeps pulling you back into interpretation, explanation, justification, and the battle between these two internal voices becomes exhausting because neither side is fully external anymore. At some point, you begin to realize that the narcissist does not need to be present for the pattern to continue. The pattern has already been installed within your emotional reflexes. It activates in silence, in solitude, in moments where nothing is happening externally, but everything feels heavy internally. That is why healing often feels like inner work more than relational work, because what needs to change is not the other person's behavior, but your internal response to what once happened. The most difficult shift is recognizing that closure is not something someone else gives you. It is something you construct within yourself by refusing to continue the cycle internally. Because as long as you keep revisiting the same emotional loops, the relationship still exists in a psychological sense, not as an active connection, but as an unresolved internal dialogue. And unresolved internal dialogues consume energy even in silence. There is a point where you stop asking what they meant and start noticing what the experience did to your perception of yourself. You begin to see how deeply you adapted just to maintain emotional stability. You see how often you suppressed your instincts to preserve connection. You see how many times you betrayed your own intuition in the name of understanding someone who consistently avoided understanding you. And this recognition shifts the focus away from them and back toward your internal alignment. The battle then becomes about reclaiming your own emotional authority, not arguing with what happened, but deciding what it means in your life moving forward. Because meaning is where the real power lies. If the meaning you assign keeps you stuck in self-doubt, the cycle continues. If the meaning restores your clarity, the cycle begins to dissolve. But this process is not linear. There are moments where the old patterns resurface unexpectedly. A memory, a trigger, a similar emotional tone in someone else can reactivate the entire internal system. And suddenly, it feels as if nothing has changed at all. This is where many people mistake activation for regression. They believe they are back at the beginning, when in reality, they are simply encountering deeper layers of the same pattern. The internal battle is not about never feeling triggered again. It is about what you do after the trigger appears. Whether you spiral into the old narrative or whether you pause long enough to recognize that the narrative itself is what you are healing from. Because awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice, and choice is the beginning of freedom. At the deepest level, the final battle is about identity. It is about whether you continue seeing yourself through the emotional distortions created in the relationship, or whether you begin reconstructing your identity based on truth instead of reaction. Because toxic dynamics often distort self-perception. You may start believing you are too sensitive, too emotional, too complicated, too difficult. Not because these things are true, but because these labels were repeatedly attached to your reactions. Healing requires unlearning those internalized distortions. It requires separating your authentic emotional responses from the labels that were placed on them. It requires recognizing that feeling deeply was never the problem, but being in an environment that punished your depth was. And once that distinction becomes clear, the internal conflict begins to lose its grip. But even then, there is resistance. Because letting go of the internal battle means letting go of familiarity. And for many people, chaos feels more familiar than peace. Emotional unpredictability becomes normalized. Silence feels suspicious. Stability feels unfamiliar. And the nervous system can mistake calmness for emptiness simply because it has not yet adapted to safety. This is why the final stage of healing often feels like rebuilding from within. You are not just moving on from a person, you are retraining your entire emotional system to no longer equate love with confusion, attention with instability, or connection with self-abandonment. And slowly, something begins to shift. The internal arguments lose intensity. The need to re-explain the past begins to fade. The emotional charge around memories starts to soften. Not because you forgot, but because you are no longer emotionally entangled in the interpretation. The story is still there, but it no longer controls your present state. This is the point where the battle stops feeling like a battle. Not because everything is resolved externally, but because internally you are no longer participating in the cycle. The thoughts may still arise, but they no longer define your emotional reality. The triggers may still appear, but they no longer dictate your response. And in that quiet shift, something profound happens. The relationship stops living inside you.